Now, in the last video of this section on economic systems, I am going to explain to you a set of common economic problems faced by a group of countries collectively referred to as transition economies. Now, this term transition economies, it was first used way back in early 1990s, 1991 to be exact. And this was when in Russia, the planned economic system totally collapsed. And finally, after almost 70 years of experimenting with this planned economy, the Russians, they decided to finally give up on this system and make a move towards a free market economic system. And since Russia was one of the major global economies using a planned economic system, when they started to make this move, a lot of other smaller countries, such as most of the countries in Eastern Europe, you can think of Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, and so on and so forth, they were also using a planned economy, and they also started to give up on the system and make a move or a transition towards a free market economic system. However, this switch from a planned to a free market economy, it's not like turning a button on and off and therefore overnight becoming a free market economy. No, it's a whole process. This transition from a planned to a free market economy, it usually takes years. And during this process of transition, there are a lot of common economic problems that these transition economies face. And what we want over here is a very simple understanding of some of the common economic problems that these transition economies come across. We don't want to go into any detail. Remember, this is not a major topic over here, but every now and then in your past A-level exams, you will see an essay question popping up asking you to explain the problems faced by these transition economies. Now, there are quite a lot of problems, but I have just chosen 4 or 5 of them, and I just will try to keep them very simple and to the point. Now, the first, and I should say a rather interesting problem that these transition economies ran into was that they suddenly found out that they don't have enough entrepreneurs in their countries. Entrepreneurs meaning businessmen. People who are willing to take the risk of making a profit or a loss and who are willing to go through the pain of running a business and making all the business decisions. These entrepreneurs were required because to move from a planned to a free market economy, the government, of course, had to privatize all the state-owned firms and all the state-owned businesses. Because planned economy, remember, everything is owned by the government, all businesses are owned and ran by the government. So to become a free market economy, these governments decided that, look, these businesses are now for sale. Any private individual, any entrepreneur can come and buy this business and then run it according to the free market system. But since these countries had been using this planned economy for sort of generations, for a lot of years, so there were no private entrepreneurs who had the experience of running a business. And therefore, these countries, first of all, these governments found it very difficult to sort of sell the businesses that the government had owned in these planned economies. And once they were able to find people, of course, as I said, since they were not experienced entrepreneurs, so usually the economy initially could not be ran very efficiently. So the next problem they ran into once they were able to privatize these firms was that they suddenly saw a sudden increase in unemployment in their countries. And there is a very simple explanation for that again. And the reason was that, you see, state-owned enterprises are usually overstaffed. You can think of any state-owned government-run business. Think of PIA, Pakistan International Airlines. It has a staff of 14,000 people for a fleet of 30 airplanes. That roughly means for each airplane there is a staff of 500 people looking after every single airplane. So state-owned enterprises, remember, usually are overstaffed, and I don't want to go into the reasons why. But once these transition economies, they started to privatize these state-owned overstaffed firms, then the private individual owners, the greedy profit-seeking entrepreneurs of the free market that became the new owners of these firms, of course, the first step they took to increase profits was to lay off any unnecessary staff. And that was one of the reasons that caused a sudden increase in unemployment. And then there was another simple reason. And that relates to the fact that in a planned economy, you see, as we have learned, the entire show is run by the government. So there is a huge government state machinery, and there are a lot of people who are employed by the government departments. But once these countries started to make a transition to a free market, of course, the role of the government diminished, and therefore a lot of people previously employed by the government now became unemployed. Now you can see that a spike in unemployment for the three transition economies of Russia, Hungary, and Poland here in this graph on the right. So all of these solid lines, the green, the red, and the blue, they reflect the unemployment rate of these transition economies. And if you see over here, in the early 1990s, the start of the transition of these economies, all of these unemployment rates are suddenly increasing at a pretty steep rate. Now, another problem that these countries ran into was the fact that these countries experienced quite a significantly high rate of inflation for quite some years after they started to make this transition. Meaning that things started to become more expensive and prices kept on increasing at quite a significantly high rate. That is what inflation means. Now again, there is a very simple reason for that, although we explain it using a very technical term, and that this inflation was due to economic liberalization and that took place in these previously planned economies. Now, all economic liberalization means is that you see in a planned economy, the government controls the prices of products. The government determines what is going to be the price of product, and the government usually keeps the prices of basic necessities very, very low. And once these economies started a transition to become a free market economy, economic liberalization meant that the government would no longer control the prices. Instead, prices would be allowed to be determined through the forces of demand and supply, the free market forces. And this meant that most of the goods would now be, their prices would reflect the true cost of producing them, which was more than what the government was previously ordering the prices to be. And that is why these countries experience quite a lot of inflation. Now again, there are other reasons, but I'm just trying to give you a simple one over here. And you can see the high amounts of inflation in these countries on this graph over here on the right. Now, this graph can, on the face of it, look misleading, but the way you read it is that this dotted line at the bottom over here is the rate of inflation during all of these years, early 1990s in UK, which was a free market economy. So this is sort of, you can say, the normal rate of inflation during those times. And now if you compare all of these green and red and yellow lines, which are measuring the inflation rates in these transition economies, again of Russia, Hungary, and Poland, then you see inflation of 20%, 35%, and much, much more than the low inflation of just 1, 2, 3% in the UK. And then there were other issues. One of them was that most of these countries, they had a lot of capital, but it was mostly outdated capital. Now, capital, remember, are the things with which you can make more goods and services. That's the definition of capital. But what it means is tools, equipments, machines, and the infrastructure that the country possesses. Now, these planned economies, as we learned, it's a very dead system where there is no innovation, whereas there is no focus on quality because there is no competition, there is no incentive. So although they had a lot of capital, but it was not, most advanced of the capitals that was available at that time in the other parts of the world. And that made things difficult for them. And then there was also capital flight, meaning that some of the private owners of the capital, they decided that instead of using their resources and start a business in these transition economies, which were, not stable at that time, they had these issues of unemployment, of inflation, and there were a lot of other things going on. So they would much rather, just move to a new country and start new business over there. So there was a lot of capital flight, again, complicating things for these transition economies in the very beginning. And lastly, another very important issue at the end is that these countries, they did not have proper legal systems that were required for the working of the free market economy. Because you see, in a planned economy, everything is owned by the government. So there are no laws protecting the rights of the consumers or the producers. There are not even any property rights or copyrights. Now, lack of property right means that you basically may be producing a thing, but you don't really own it in the legal sense. So, of course, we take all of this for granted, but in these planned economies, there were no property rights. So they needed to come with a new legal system, new laws, and they needed to sort of give the assurance to the people that they would be able to implement as a government these new laws and protect the copyrights and the property rights of the individuals working in this free market. Now again, as I said, the list can go on and on, but I think these are enough. Again, remember, it's not a major topic, but just briefly remember and be in a position where you can throw them out if you're asked in an essay question.